Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for coming out today. Welcome to Darien Library. My name is Erin Shea, and I do the programs here at the library. I would just like to briefly mention that programs are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign. So thank you so much for your continued support to make events like these possible. Tonight's guest is the author of 12 best-selling novels dealing with real women, real life, and all things in between. She writes a daily blog and contributes to various publications, including Huffington Post, The Sunday Times, and Self. A foodie and passionate cook, most weekends see her cooking for guests in her home in Westport, Connecticut, where she lives with her husband and their 6 children. She's here tonight to discuss her latest work, Tempting Fate, which came out just today. If anyone watched the Today Show this morning, she was on it. In this book, she tackles a hot button issue for women, which is temptation outside marriage. We're so excited to host her here at Darien Library. Please join me in welcoming Miss Jane Green.
Really lovely to be here. I've wanted to talk at the Darien Library for ages and ages, and I don't know why I haven't, but thank you for asking me, and it's so nice to be here. Did anyone see the Today Show this morning? Yes? The nicest thing about doing the Today Show is that they have fantastic hair and makeup artists, and it lasts all day. I think I am not going to wash my face or wash my hair ever again. So I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about my career and my books and the inspiration behind Tempting Fate. And publication is today, so it's really lovely to be here on publication day. And I'd love to, I'll read a little bit and would love to answer any questions you may have. I've just remembered something that I need to tell you. So this is actually my 15th novel. I have to change my bio. I need to update it online because I think it says it's my 12th, but it's actually my 15th novel. And I started my career in 1996 when I was living in London, and I was working as a journalist on a newspaper called the Daily Express. And a girlfriend of mine phoned me up one night and she said, "I'm writing a book in my spare time." And I said, "Well, that's nice." And then a few months later, she phoned me up and she said, "I've got a publishing deal." And she told me how much money she'd been paid for her book. And it was a lot more money than I was making at the Daily Express. And I remember thinking, well, hang on a minute, she's not even a writer. If she can do it, I can definitely do it. So I left my job at the Daily Express, and I gave myself 3 months to write a book and get a publishing deal. This is not something I recommend to anyone, by the way. I sent off, and that first book was called Straight Talking, and it came out in a flurry. I was so excited about telling my story, the story of my friends, and everything that we were going through. And I very excitedly sent 3 chapters and a synopsis off to an agent. And after a few weeks, I got a letter back saying, "Your characters are immature, your situations lack credibility, and your work is frankly unpublishable." So I sunk into a deep depression. And a friend of mine then said to me, "You can't let one person's opinion put you off. Why not do a mail shot?" So I sent my book off to 13 agents then, fully expecting them all to write back and say, "Thanks, but no thanks." And within a week, 9 of them had come back and said, "Well, we love what we've read. Can we read the rest?" And I think about 2 days before that 3-month period that I'd given myself, I had just enough money to last, and I was freelancing for various magazines, Cosmopolitan and the Daily Mail. And about 2 days before that 3 months was up, there was a bidding war for my first book. And there was this big auction, and I ended up signing a 2-book deal. And that first book went straight onto the bestseller list in England, and here I am, 15 books later. By the way, journalism was the best training I could ever have had. I think so many of us have this romantic notion of what it is to be a novelist. We think that novelists wake up in the middle of the night and think, oh, inspiration, and we go downstairs in our pajamas and we write for hours. And sometimes that is true. But more often, it is a job. And, you know, as a journalist, I would sit there every day, and every day I'd have an editor standing above me saying, Jane, we need 1,500 words on this in an hour. And I couldn't say, I'm so sorry, I'm not inspired today. Try me again tomorrow. It was my job to write 1,500 words in an hour, and so I would write 1,500 words in an hour. I was telling somebody recently, I remember once writing 1,500 words about ankle bracelets. I don't know where I pulled that from. I have to try and find it. I do have a portfolio somewhere knocking around in the basement. I don't know how on earth I managed to write 1,500 words on ankle bracelets, but I did, because that was my job. And so often now, I look at the page and I think, I have no idea what to write. I'm stuck. How am I going to do this? How am I going to finish this book? And what I have discovered is what I learned back then as a journalist, that the only way to get the creativity flowing, the only way to find the words, is to write through it and to keep writing even when you think you have nothing to say. And what happens is those first few words are like squeezing blood from a stone. It feels like just slog, and every word is painful, but then all of a sudden something will come into your head and it gets a little bit easier. And then you keep writing and suddenly something else comes in, and before you know it, the flow is back and you are writing again. So I started my career as a single girl living in London. And then as my life progressed, I met a man, I got married, I moved to America, and funnily enough, my books became about marriage and living in America and motherhood. And they've always charted the course of my life without ever being my story. I moved straight from London to Westport, Connecticut. And it's so interesting for me to look back at the books that I wrote when I first moved to Westport. And before I had a full understanding of the town in which I lived, I thought I was moving to Nantucket. I thought I was moving to the sleepy little New England town of artists and writers. And I wrote, my first book I wrote when I moved to Westport was To Have and to Hold. And in it, Westport is this charming, charming little town. And within about 4 years, I was writing Life Swap, where Wall Street had taken over Westport and everybody was tearing down these gorgeous antique houses and building these awful McMansions. And then I moved. And I moved up to an old farm in Litchfield, Connecticut. And by the way, I never said that I was writing about Westport. And the truth is, I pulled from many towns. I pulled from Westport, I pulled from New Canaan, and I created the fictitious town of Highfield. And I did that partly because it was never entirely Westport, and also because I thought nobody would ever talk to me again if I actually came clean. So this, Tempting Fate, is the first book that I have written where I have actually held my hand up and said, it is Westport. I set the whole thing in Westport. The first scene in the book happens at the Grey Goose in Southport. So it's all, familiar. They're all local places. Inspiration can come from anywhere. Sometimes, as I'm ending a book, I get the idea for the next one. And it can come from a magazine article. It can come from a conversation with someone. It can come often on planes and trains for some reason. I think there's something about that ambient noise that really inspires creativity. But sometimes I've got nothing. And I changed publishers about 3 years ago, and I have a new publisher and a new editor who works in a very different way, in a much more collaborative way. And she now phones me up when we're ready to talk about the new book, and she says, let's have lunch, and we go out for lunch, and she says to me, what's going on in your life? What are you talking about with your friends? What are you noticing in the town in which you live? Are there any themes? Is there anything that you are thinking about or your friends are talking about? And this time around with Tempting Fate, I was inspired. I did know what I wanted to write about. The first thing that happened was that in Westport, I suddenly noticed here I am in my mid-40s, and a number of women that I know suddenly announced that they had been terribly unhappy in their marriages for years. Their husbands were awful, and you knew the husbands, and the husbands were generally not awful, but the husbands were awful, they were terribly unhappy, and they were leaving. And I watched this happen 4 or 5 times. In every case, these women started to look fantastic. They got very skinny, and they started to look very glamorous, with a glow. And you would invariably find out that they were having an affair. And they were always having an affair, not with somebody, it was always the diametric opposite of their husband. It was the tennis coach, or the guy they met at the gym, or the art instructor. And in every case, no one wants to think of themselves as someone who would have an affair. This was never just an affair. This was their soulmate. This was the man that they were supposed to have been with. And I watched it happen, and I started to think about women's infidelity. I've written quite a lot about men's infidelity, but I'd never written about women's infidelity. And yet I was seeing it happen around me over and over, and I started to think, what's happening here? What's happening to these women? Why is this happening? The second thing that happened was that I was going into New York one night for a night out, and I was all dressed up. I think I looked pretty good. I was feeling really good. I got the train in, I got to Grand Central, and I came up the subway steps and was walking along Park Avenue, and it happened to be in rush hour. And there was a sea of men in suits walking towards me, hundreds of them. And I suddenly realized not a single one was looking at me. And they were all looking to my left and to my right. And I turned to my left, and there was a 22-year-old blonde. And I turned to my right, and there was a 24-year-old brunette. And I suddenly realized that I'm at an age where I am invisible. And I go into stores, and the young male sales assistants no longer jump and say, "Can I help you, miss?" They say, "I'll be with you in a minute, ma'am." The ma'am is the killer, by the way. It all just, you know it's all going horribly wrong when you hear the ma'am. But I'm invisible. I'm a 45-year-old woman, and I'm invisible. And the third thing that happened was that I went to a book event a couple of years ago, and one of the other authors was this extremely young, extremely cute man, and we had this lovely chat. And then afterwards he started emailing me, and these emails were, I realized after a while, flirtatious. And it was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to me. I am incredibly happily married. I absolutely adore my husband. But I realized that these emails made me feel beautiful, and there was something very addictive about that. And I remember very clearly one day suddenly sitting back and thinking, oh, that's how these affairs happen. That's how it starts. And those 3 things combined really were what gave me the inspiration for Tempting Fate. I also think that social media, it is so easy, and so many of these women that I watched, all of these relationships were happening via email, text, Facebook. And of course the danger with that is that we're not presenting our true selves on Facebook. We're presenting this perfectly packaged, version of ourselves. Even today, I've been posting pictures from the Today Show all day. Some of those pictures, I look heinous. I look horrible. Those are not the pictures I'm posting. I'm carefully choosing, which pictures to post to make sure that I look as good as I possibly can. And we're all doing it. We're all doing it. We're all writing these pithy commentaries on our lives that make us seem brighter, more sparkly, better somehow, our best versions of ourselves, which is, of course, the other danger of these relationships happening in this way. And I do think that email fosters this tremendous sense of false intimacy. So this time round, I met my editor for lunch in the city, and I said, well, I've got it. I've got the new book. And she said, okay, so, what is it? Great, I'm excited. And I said, well, I'm noticing these women having affairs, and I feel invisible. No one looks at me anymore, and this guy's been sending me these flirty emails, and I kind of get how addictive that would be, and there's my book. And she looked at me and she said, what's the story? And I said, well, that's the story. It's a woman having an affair. And she went, Jane, that's not a story. So we then came up with the story. One of the reasons why I chose this particular editor, and I met with 5 publishers when I was looking to change publishers. I had 6 books with Random House, 6 books with Penguin, and then when I looked to change, this woman walked in and she talked to me about my books with extraordinary wisdom and clarity. And she said 2 things that have stuck with me. She said, when you're writing a book like yours, you always have to ask of your protagonist 3 questions. What does she want? Why can't she have it? How is she going to get it? And you have to ask those questions throughout the book. And she said, I can put it another way, even more succinctly. They came, they attacked, we fought back. And it was the first time that anyone had really explained to me what I do in such incredibly simple terms. And it was one of the reasons why I picked her. She has taught me extraordinary amounts about editing. She works me so hard. I usually go through at least one almost full rewrite of my books now, which I never used to do. We go through it line by line, word by word. And I'm happy to say I do think, and the reviews back this up, that I'm writing the best books of my career, and this is all entirely down to her. There's a wonderful line in a play called Seminar by Teresa Rebeck, which was on Broadway a couple of years ago with Alan Rickman as the writing teacher. And in it, the editor says, it really is the only way to learn anything about writing, to have a decent editor go through it word by word for you, help you see what it is, what you meant, what you didn't even know you meant. And that is something I've absolutely experienced with her. I would love to read a little bit and then perhaps take questions. So before I start reading, the story we came up with is the story of Gabby, a 43-year-old woman who lives in Westport. 2 children, very happy, happily married, adores her husband, goes out one night on a girls' night out, and a younger man starts talking to her at the bar, and they have this lovely conversation, and she doesn't think anything other than, well, how lovely to have met this person and to have had this nice connection. And then he starts emailing her. And after a while, she becomes, well, she finds herself intoxicated by these emails. It doesn't have anything to do with her husband. It doesn't even really have anything to do with him. It's about feeling desired again. It's about feeling beautiful. It's having someone notice her and want her. And she tells herself throughout this email exchange, which goes on for months, this is my friend. I would never have an affair. I would never do anything. But she just wants to keep it going, just to feel beautiful, to keep feeling beautiful. He comes back to town on a business trip, and her husband is away. And they have this one night together. In fact, no, it's not even one night. It's probably about 20 minutes. And when it's over, she looks at herself in the mirror, and she feels nothing but guilt and remorse and shame. She knows that it will never happen again. She will never see him again. And she also knows that she will take this secret to her grave. Her husband will never find out. And then you have to buy the book to find out what happens. So I will now read a little bit. And I just have to say that 3 books ago, I phoned up my publishers because I used to read an awful lot at events like this. And I said, I'd really love to read my own audiobooks. And they went, oh, Jane, every author thinks they can read their own audiobooks, but none of them can. I said, no, but could I try? Jane, you really can't. I said, well, can you at least audition me? And so they agreed to audition me. So this woman showed up at my house with all this equipment, with microphones and things, and she walked in. My husband opened the door, and my husband said, oh, Jane's really excited about this. And she went, every author thinks they can read their own books, but they can't. Anyway, I auditioned and I passed. So I read that. The first book that I read was Another Piece of My Heart. When the reviews came out, I noticed that a number of the reviews, they were very complimentary, other than a number of them said, why is an English person reading a book that's only about American characters? And I thought, oh, I can change that. So I now have, in the subsequent books, they've all had a little bit of English in them. And Gabby is English, living in America. And in my next book, Saving Grace, Grace is English, living in America. When they first moved to the suburbs in their late 20s with one baby, no one would have dreamed of being unfaithful. Too busy building their families, shuffling to mummy and me groups, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep. The women she knew were either wearing maternity clothes as they waited for babies to arrive, or because they weren't able to get their pre-pregnancy figures back. No one had time to exercise, unless it constituted a leisurely walk around the beach with children strapped safely in a stroller. They certainly didn't have the time, energy, or inclination to have an affair. Even the marriages that perhaps should never have been, the marriages kept together by the glue of their children, the routine of making new friends, building a home in an unfamiliar town, trucked along with no question of either husband or wife ever being unfaithful. The years have passed, and Gabby and her friends are no longer the newcomers to town, young women with babies, convinced they are the only women in the world to have babies, demanding the world stop to accommodate them. Gabby often finds herself standing in line at CVS as a young mother with a baby stresses out over the lack of the right formula. Everything in her body language, her speech, announces that she is a mother, she has a baby, she is more important than everyone else. Gabby looks around and catches the eye of other middle-aged mothers, their grey roots beginning to show, puffy shadows under their eyes, fleeces and clogs because they can no longer be bothered to dress to impress. And they exchange understanding smiles at these young, entitled women. I remember when I too thought the world revolved around me, says the smile. I remember when I too thought I knew everything, deserved everything, was entitled to everything and more. Oh, how little we knew. Few of the mothers worked when Gabby moved to town. They were, they announced proudly, stay-at-home moms. They volunteered to be room mothers, joined the PTA, accompanied the children on every field trip, showed up in the classroom, having spontaneously baked 24 nut-free, lactose-free, gluten-free cupcakes. These same women were left stranded by the time their children entered middle school. The women who didn't work suddenly longed to have something to do all day, longed to reinvent themselves or perhaps find themselves again. They would invariably take up Zumba or yoga, meet friends for lunch daily at the organic market before slowly rejoining the workforce, some working part-time, others attempting to run businesses from the comfort of their kitchen table. The bodies of those friends have changed. Once soft and squishy, elastic from the stresses and strains of childbirth, those bodies have, in their 40s, suddenly been honed into toned shape from Pilates, yoga, spinning. I should have added bar method, but I didn't. No, that's the next book. Dowdy, during the days of her kids' early childhood, Gabby is surrounded by two extremes of women now that she is approaching the afternoon of life. The women, like her, in their shapeless, comfortable clothes, secure in their husband's love, in their place in the world, who have not yet felt the need to reinvent themselves as time slips slowly away. And the glamour pusses, like Trish, who have reinvented themselves in middle age, although Trish has doubtless been perfect since the day she was born. The glamour pusses may be 40-something, but they are fitter, prettier, far better dressed than they were back then. Partly because they have to be. In this affluent town, at this age, there is always someone around the next corner who could take their place. And it isn't just the women who need to be worried. In the last year, 4 women Gabby knows, not friends, but women from the neighborhood she has known for years, have suddenly left their husbands. They say they've been unhappy for years, tell stories of how terrible the husbands are, even when the husbands have always seemed delightful, before everyone discovers that in each of the cases, there were other men involved. In one case, the husband of her best friend. In the others, random men picked up at the gym or at an AA meeting, the contractor. Gabby found herself sitting in living rooms for coffee as these women told tales of how terrible their husband had been before swooning with delight as they lit up describing the perfection of their new man. Each time, they described these men as their soulmates. Why else would they have broken up their marriages, exploded their lives, alienated, or at the very least caused immeasurable pain to their children? No one likes to think of themselves as the kind of person who would have an affair, who would ever betray their spouse so monumentally, so unforgivably, so heartlessly, unless they had no choice. Unless they found the one person the gods had chosen for them, the one person they were supposed to have married, had circumstances not got in the way and slipped their boring old husband in instead. Gabby, who had always thought of it as a midlife crisis, hadn't ever really understood why these women left their stable lives, their loving husbands, their comfortable homes, until today, as she slouches back on the sofa, blankly staring at the television screen, knowing exactly how these things happen. You have a choice, she was fond of saying. Just because you're married doesn't mean you're not attracted to anyone else. You're married, not dead. We're all going to be attracted to other people at some point, but ultimately it all comes down to a choice. So easy to say when you've never been presented with a choice, and honestly, Gabby had never felt an attraction to anyone other than Elliott since the moment they met. Last night, Gabby had a choice. She had many choices. She could have gone home with her friends. She could have called a cab from the bar, not gone back to the hotel with him, because however much she may try to deny it, even to herself, she knew the possibility was there. That moment in the hotel lobby, late, quiet, when their eyes locked and held, neither of them speaking, chemistry surging in waves. She had a choice then. She could have so easily stayed, let him lean forward, kiss her gently on the lips. He didn't, but she knows he would have. She sits playing this moment in her mind over and over again. He didn't, but he would have. He didn't, but he could have. And if he had, how would it have felt? And if he had, how would she be feeling now? Thank you. So on that note, I would love to answer some questions. I see a question already, yes. Yeah, and if you read my books, most of my books are about women who, to the outside world, appear to have everything, appear to have perfect lives, but that's exactly that, and I say that all the time. You never know what goes on behind closed doors. I absolutely believe that to be true. The process of working with my editor, it's extraordinary, actually. We will sit. And it's always the same. We sit and we have lunch and we talk and we just talk, we sort of gossip and talk about stuff. And then at a certain point during the meal, everything falls away and it's just her and me sitting in this restaurant. And she'll say, okay, so what are you thinking of? And I'll say, well, I've got this character in my head and her name's Gabby. And she has this effect. She goes, yeah, but well, there has to be something in the marriage. There has to be a resentment. And by the way, I think that's true. And part of this story is there is a resentment in the marriage. Gabby was desperate for more children. And her husband was not. Her husband didn't want any. He had a vasectomy planned. She wanted him to cancel it. He didn't. He went ahead with it. And so she's been carrying this resentment for a year. However, I think that marriage is full of resentments. I think that we all harbor those little resentments every day. I think there are always things that we carry. But that was how it happened. When we came up with, she said, well, there's got to be a resentment. What could it be? And I would say, well, what about if she wanted more children and he had yes, and that's literally, we will sit there for 2 or 3 hours just like that. Sometimes we get stuck. Sometimes, because she's a big believer in the very traditional Greek 3-act structure, beginning, middle, and end. But at the end of every act, you have a dramatic plot point that spins you into the next act. And sometimes we get stuck and we sit there thinking, well, what has to happen? And then she'll keep repeating, what does she want? What does she want? What does she stand to lose? And that's how we come up with it. Well, I think I rarely make assumptions just based on my one experience. I draw from everything that I'm hearing from everyone around me. So no, I didn't speak to a marriage counselor. I read a fascinating book about women's infidelity, a non-fiction book. And I spoke to lots of people. I spoke to lots of women. I recently actually was talking to one of the women who describes her now ex-husband as the love of her life, still. And she had an affair. And I said to her, well, why? Why did you have an affair? And she looked at me and she said, with huge regret, I was bored. And I think, I talk to people all the time. I observe. People also tell me stories. And that's really where I pull from. Anyone else? Yes. So how much of writing? And I have an agent. I was going to go around. And so it's part of it that I don't really want to. Well, I think it seems like it's a big part of it. Yeah, I think the bigger part now is social media. We used to have, when I started, we would have marketing teams and publicists, and they would do everything for you, giving you the space and time and freedom to write your books. Now, you have to be on Twitter every day, you have to be on Facebook every day, you have to be on Instagram every day, you have to blog, you have to update, you have to answer emails. It is the most, and you cannot, some people do have other people do that for, but you know, I know my readers know when it's me and when it's not. They're looking for my voice and my take on the world, not a publicist and not somebody who doesn't write in the same way. So I would say that that's much more of what people have to do. Most writers that I know detest public speaking. It's sort of a necessary evil for them. I happen to love it, which is bizarre because I'm actually ridiculously introverted and painfully shy. But I can stand in front of a room of people and I actually really enjoy it. But I certainly know many writers who really don't. I mean, you have to be able to do it. If you're publicizing your book, you do have to be able to stand up and talk to people. But you don't have to do a lot of public speaking, I don't think. Kind of. I try and in spots. Like right now, I'm doing my book tour. So I have been in Florida for the past 4 out of 5 weekends. Then I'm going to Seattle, Chicago, LA, North Carolina, South Carolina, Atlanta. I'm tired even thinking about it. But I have little kids. I mean, my kids are still quite young. So this is actually the first time that I'm away for a few days, and my wonderful husband is looking after the children. Generally, I do travel quite a lot, but only for a couple of days at a time. So I do quite a lot of keynote speaking. So then I will fly somewhere and do my talk and get home. Thank you.
With your sickness, and now we're all well.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know, in June of 2011, I started to get sick, and I didn't know what it was. I knew that something was very wrong. I could barely get out of bed. I was sort of walking up two steps and then just would sort of collapse and couldn't make it up the stairs. Gained a tremendous amount of weight. And then all these other odd symptoms kept coming, and I kept on getting odd diagnoses. It was fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, and then I went to see a psychiatrist, and he said bipolar disorder and put me on all these antipsychotics, which gain weight. Anyway, eventually, after all of these misdiagnoses, I was diagnosed with chronic Lyme disease, and that was in September of last year. And I'd had 2 years where I hadn't been able to tour or travel. And I hadn't really been able to do anything. I didn't do any television. I did very, very few things like this. I mean, I couldn't. I didn't have the energy. I was so exhausted. But I have a wonderful doctor now. It was just a huge relief to find out what it was. And as soon as he said, every time they said fibromyalgia or bipolar, I was like, really? I really don't think that's what it is. And finally, this time when he said chronic Lyme, I went, oh, that actually makes perfect sense. Because of course what happens is it kicks off an autoimmune response in your body. So I have a ton of autoimmune, I could write you a long list of all the autoimmune problems I have. Happily, the treatment is working. I have a year of antibiotic shots, and I'm feeling really good. Also nutritionally, I've completely changed what I eat. I've cut out all sugar, all carbohydrates, alcohol, and I feel great. So I think that's had a really big part to play in it. Yeah, thank you. I'm getting back there. No. Do you know what? I really think that and people have been asking me that for years because I have little children. I think it's an art, and I think the people who do it and do it well, I could never do that. I actually, my daughter came home a couple of years ago with this new best friend, and it was all very exciting. And when her mother came to pick her up, and she came into the kitchen, she said, "I'm Victoria," and I said, "Hi," and she said, "I'm actually a writer too," and I was like, "Oh, great." And she said, and I said, what do you write? She said, "Oh, children's books, children." I said, "Oh, would I know? Pinkalicious." It's huge. But again, you look at something like Pinkalicious, it's beautifully illustrated by her, it's beautifully written. I think it's a real craft, and not one that I can do. Yeah, I'm also not very good at short stories. I'd like to be. I often get magazines coming to me saying, can you write a short story? And it's actually a great way of publicizing your book. I'm just not very good at them. So luckily I'm quite good at the long ones. I didn't used to. I used to have an idea, but my books were, before this editor, were much more about characters, and I would let the characters tell their own story. One of my favorite books to write was The Beach House, and that brought together a whole series of people in Nantucket. And I knew all of their stories, so I knew that one of them was married, but he was secretly gay. I knew that one of them had gone through this divorce. I knew their stories, but I had no idea how it was going to end, and I loved writing it. My new editor won't let me do that anymore. Now it has to have drama and plot and crises, and she says it has to get bad, then it has to get worse, then it has to get much, much worse. But I think my books are much tighter. They're much tighter than they ever were. The Beach House is a lovely, gentle meander through Nantucket for a summer, whereas this has drama. This is a page turner. Yeah. So Saving Grace, which I handed in 2 weeks ago, comes out in December. And that is the story of a couple who live in New York, Palisades, Sneden's Landing, actually, if anyone knows Sneden's Landing. And he is an older best-selling author, but his career is on the wane. And she is his lovely wife. And they take on an assistant who appears to be the Mary Poppins of the assistant world. She is just the most wonderful assistant. She makes their life so much easier in every way until she systematically starts to destroy it. So that is Saving Grace. Okay, so do I write in a linear way, and how many hours a day do I write? I do write in a linear way. I always have done. And I never work on more than one project at a time. I start at the beginning and I keep going until the end. And that's part of my discipline as well. If I went back, or if I took time to edit in between, I don't think I would ever get anything done. Because, by the way, the editing process is never done. When I read to you from Tempting Fate, I think, oh, I wish I'd changed that word, and oh, I wish I could rewrite that sentence. And I think that about every single book that I have written. Hours a day, I set myself a word count. It's really high. I set myself 3,000 words a day, and I am usually at my desk by 9, and I'm done by 1. So it's never more than 4 hours. However, now I've just signed a new contract. I have to write 2 books a year. So what that means, I know. Now what I also do, in addition to writing every day, is I take myself off twice a year to a self-imposed writing retreat. And I go off and find these little inns and these little B&Bs in Connecticut, New Hampshire, Maine, and I take my laptop and I have no Wi-Fi, and I don't talk to anyone, and I sequester myself away in a room for 5 days, and I do nothing but write. And actually, I love that, because the extraordinary thing about that is, because there are no distractions, I am fully immersed in the world of my characters, and they come to life in a way that they just can't quite when I'm doing 3 or 4 hours a day and then getting on with my life and driving children around. And it's a very different experience, and one that I really love. That's about 10 hours a day, by the way. Yes. Oh. But doesn't that ruin the story for you? Wow. Gosh, I have no superstitions. I will often, in fact, usually now, I read the acknowledgements page first. I don't know why I do that. I want to see who's their editor, who's their agent, who are their friends, do I know any of them? And so I read that first, but nothing else. I read all the time, everything. I mean, the most recent books I've read, the Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, has a really lovely literary novel called The Signature of All Things that I just finished. There's a book that I'm telling everyone they have to read. If you like my books, there's another English author called Jojo Moyes who has written a book called Me Before You that is just fantastic, but make sure you have a very big box of tissues handy. And I really quite like suspense novels. I quite like a really good thriller, and I'm just in the middle of a series by an English husband and wife duo called Nikki French, and they write really wonderful books. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Nantucket, it was such a hardship. I had to go and spend a lot of time in Nantucket. And I also, one of the things about that story, The Beach House, which, by the way, Kathy Lee Gifford, I think, has read or is reading. She was incredibly lovely about The Beach House. She lived on Nantucket, I think, for 20 years. My husband grew up summering on Nantucket, so he really told me stories and taught me about old Nantucket, and that was really what I wanted to know. I wanted to know what was Nantucket like before all the big New York money moved in. What was it like for Nan? What was it like in the 60s and the 70s? And I think I saw an awful lot of that through my husband. And I talked to people. I talked to lots and lots of people. I set another piece of my heart in Mill Valley. And the beauty of having something like Facebook is you can post, does anyone know anyone in Mill Valley that I could sit down and talk to? And I ended up sitting down with people who live there and talking to people in coffee shops. And people are so extraordinarily generous with their time. When you tell them that you're writing a novel, they will sit and talk to you for hours, which, thank heavens. But I also think part of being an author is the ability to empathize and to put yourself in others' shoes and to use your imagination in a way that hopefully is real. So just one last thing that I'd love to say is that I did an interview with Joe Myers of the Connecticut Post, and I think he writes for a lot of the local papers as well. And he said, are you worried that that people are going to struggle with this subject matter, because it's a tough subject matter, women's infidelity. And in fact, some of the reviews, there are women who say, well, I can't read a book about this. I'm so against it. I can't condone it, and I won't read it. And I have to say that I do think in this book, as with all my books, although it perhaps didn't come across in the piece that I read out earlier. I'm writing about the human condition. I'm writing about people who are flawed. I think we are all flawed. We are all doing the best that we can. And I try very hard not to be judgmental about the mistakes that we make. And I think although what Gabby does is not something that I condone and is not something that any of you will condone, I think what I'm trying to do is help you understand it, help myself understand it. And I think that, I hope that that comes across. So on that note, I think, do we have books for sale? Excellent. I'd love to sign some. Thank you.